matched.
That would have been hilarious. They would have said, what are these ladies doing? Yeah. Hey everyone, and welcome to Chef AJ Live. I'm your host, Chef AJ, and this is where I introduce you to amazing people like you who are doing great things in the world that I think you should know about. I am so excited and honored to meet today's guest because she's been on my radar for a very long time because she's really an expert in something that is near and dear to my heart, and that's food addictions, sugar addiction specifically. She has an amazing TED Talk with over 10 million views and lots of books, which we're going to talk about today, which we're actually going to talk about sugar addiction and how to get sugar out of your diet for good. Please welcome Dr. Nicole Avena. It's so nice to meet you. I didn't know you were gorgeous.
Oh, thank you so much. It's so great to meet you too. And I'm so happy to be here.
I love to hear people's stories about what got them interested in it, because I don't think you yourself were really a sugar addict, were you?
No, I wasn't. I had a pretty interesting way that I found myself in this field. I was actually a graduate student at Princeton University. I had just started my PhD, and I was really interested in studying the brain and neuroscience. And I was trying to come up with a project for my PhD dissertation. And my advisor, whose name is Bart Hobel, he was the person who kind of just introduced me to this whole idea of maybe food could be addictive, and this could be something that we should study in the lab, and we really don't have any experiments that have been done on this. And maybe this is why so many people are struggling with overeating and obesity. Maybe it's the food, maybe it's not the people. And so that's really how I got involved. I started doing a whole bunch of experiments in the lab, trying to better understand what was happening in the brain in response to sugar and processed foods. And fast forward 15 years and I'm still doing the same thing.
Well, I really appreciate your work because it gives credence to people like me who know we've suffered with this for years and have had doctors kind of laugh in our face saying, well, you can't be addicted to sugar. And thank you so much for the work you do.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, people like you and your struggles, like this has inspired the work. And, when we first started doing the research, we had a lot of anecdotal accounts and a lot of people talking about how they felt like they were compelled to eat sugar and how they felt like they were addicted to it, but there wasn't any empirical evidence to back that up. And so I'm happy that we've been able to provide some of that evidence to help people to really, have their stories be heard by doctors and not have it be dismissed.
Yeah, because, like if you struggle with alcohol addiction, nobody that knows that you're an alcoholic would say to you, well, what's wrong with you? You don't have any willpower. Can't you push yourself away from the bar after one drink? But when it comes to food, people, and I see this all the time with my clients, especially the ladies, their husband says, well, you just don't have any willpower. And they bring the crap into the home and they taunt them and they tempt them. And so I cannot wait for the day that people actually believe this, because a lot of people still don't, even medical doctors.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. And we've seen advances. I have to say, when we first started doing this research, people were literally throwing tomatoes at us at the scientific conferences. They didn't think it was very serious. They didn't think it was something that you could put like food and drugs in the same category as both being addictive. But I think now that so much evidence is out there now, and so many researchers and doctors have been, backing this up and doing more studies to support it, more and more people are listening. So I think we still have a lot of work to do, but we're getting there.
Yeah, thank you. Well, so let's start with the question. Can processed food be as addictive as drugs and alcohol, at least for some people?
It absolutely can. And we've spent, like I said, many, many years trying to understand this and study it. One of the big things that we've been doing in my lab is to take the criteria that are used to diagnose someone as having an addiction to drugs and apply them to food to see, well, can we see addiction when the substance of abuse is food? Is it processed food, foods high in sugar? And we've been able to show that all the criteria are met when the substance of abuse is food. We see binging, we see withdrawal, we see cravings. We also see neurochemical changes in the brain that are like what you would see when someone is using a drug of abuse. And so it's not just the behaviors that we're seeing, but also the changes in the brain that are happening at the same time in response to overeating food.
Well, with all this proof, why are people still doubting that it exists? And who was Columbus discovered America? They say, who was the first person that really was brave enough to say, hey, I think this is an addiction?
Yeah, so I think that the reason why we're still feeling some pushback is because of the term addiction. This is a term that, for many, many years has been reserved for just substances like alcohol and drugs. And now we're starting to see that changing. In the latest iteration of the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, it's a book basically that the American Psychiatric Association puts out that defines psychiatric disorders and what they currently mean based off of the research. They've actually begun to move away from addiction being just something for drugs and alcohol, and they've opened it up to gambling. They're opening it up to process addictions. And so I think we're starting to see that that term is changing and the definition is changing. And I think that's going to help the cause for food addiction, because we'll be able to see that it's going to fall under that umbrella a little bit more clearly than it has in the past.
Well, how do certain foods overactivate the reward centers in our brain? And maybe just talk a little bit about what these reward centers are.
Yeah, so basically in our brains, we have primitive regions of the brain that, have been there as we evolved, right? And so these are our instinctual, desired parts of the brain, and they're reinforcing behaviors that we need to engage in to survive as a species. And so sexual behavior, eating is one, bonding with others. These are things we need to do to make sure we survive. And so we get activity in the limbic system, which is part of this brain reward system, when we do those things. And what happens with food is that, normally people eat food and it activates the limbic system a little bit, but not really to the extent you would expect to see if it was a novel food or something that was dangerous maybe. But what ends up happening with the types of foods in our modern food environment is that they're activating this brain system in a way that's putting it into overdrive. And it's releasing dopamine, it's releasing opioids. And the pattern of release that we see with many of the processed foods and sugar-rich foods is very similar to the same type of activity we see when someone's using drugs or alcohol. And so we're seeing that basically these systems that are put in place to reinforce behavior are being hijacked by highly processed food. And that's what causes us to feel so good when we eat it. But that's also what causes us to get into this vicious cycle of addiction, where you binge on it and you feel good for a moment, but then you feel with cravings and withdrawal and guilt that's associated with it. And the spiral just continues and continues.
Do you think that processed food addiction existed before processed food? And I know that sounds like a stupid question, but did anybody even have a problem with food before processed food?
Well, if you look at, the obesity rates, and again, these things are influenced by a variety of factors. So we can't boil everything down to food addiction and our food environment. But if you do take a look at our history, you can see that obesity rates have gone up, metabolic disease rates have gone up over the past 50 years. Preventable lifestyle related conditions have all increased over time. And this is correlated with our over reliance on highly processed foods. We're, in a society now where we're a convenience culture. People are utilizing these processed foods in our grocery stores all the time, and more so than they are chopping and preparing healthy foods at home. And so I think that that's catching up with us, and it's catching up with our children too. We're seeing that these rates of obesity, rates of type 2 diabetes are being, up so high in little kids. And 50 years ago, little kids never had type 2 diabetes. You'd never ever hear of that. But now it's relatively commonplace to see a child that's struggling with it.
Is there something special about sugar that activates the reward center of the brain, or is it just the processing of it? And can flour do the same thing?
Yeah, so great question. It's a little bit of both. And so we started off actually studying sugar because sugar was the thing that stuck out amongst people who were talking about how they felt like they had a sugar addiction. They felt compelled to eat sugar and they were drawn towards sugar-rich foods. And so we started off studying sugar, and what we found was that it can indeed produce these various signs of addiction. But what's also interesting, in later studies that we did, we were looking at the properties associated with foods that were found to be addictive. And the number one predictor variable that stood out was how highly processed the food was. So the more highly processed the food, the more likely it is to be addictive. Now, the two kind of go hand in hand, because we know that most of the processed foods that are out there contain added sugar. So it's relatively likely that if you're eating a diet that's high in processed foods, you're also eating a diet that's very high in added sugars.
Do you think it's worse when things are added to it, like fat and salt? Because the people that I know that say they're sugar addicts, it's not a gummy bear problem.
Right.
You know?
No, it's true. And I think that it's, we've looked at this in my lab to try to better understand the different forms of sugar addiction, because like you mentioned a few minutes ago, there's flour. There's plenty of people out there who could care less about eating cookies and cakes, but give them a loaf of bread or a pound of pasta, and that's their thing. And so we're really starting to try to better understand, from the neuroscience standpoint, what parts of the brain are being activated in people with the sweet tooth type of sugar craving versus, the bread and pasta type of sugar craving. And I think there's different groups of people. I think that, it's going to depend on genetics. It's going to depend on individual differences. But I think it's something that, hopefully we'll learn more about as our research goes on.
Is it just the sweet taste that activates this reward center? Because a lot of people turn to things that I personally, as both a chef and just somebody that works with people, I think sometimes the 0-calorie sweeteners like the aspartame and the ones that are like erythritol, xylitol, mannitol, sorbitol, stevia, I find that the people that have sugar addiction, those actually are worse for them.
Well, based off of the research, you're right. And what we found in our laboratory studies that we've done looking at this is that it's the sweet taste that activates these brain reward systems. And so, I often talk to people about whether or not these artificial or alternative sweeteners are better or worse. And to be honest, if you have a sugar addiction and you're trying to get off of sugar, they're basically like the methadone to your opiate addiction. It's going to be a band-aid, and it might help you a little bit, but you're not going to break that vicious cycle. And so what I suggest that people do is really just try to unsweeten your diet. Just reduce the amount of any sweetener that you have. And you'll find that over time that you don't need it all. You won't need to have all this extra sugar in your diet because your brain and your tongue and your body is going to adjust to it. And I've had people that I've worked with over the years who come back to me after a few weeks of cutting out all the sugars and really cutting back. And they'll say, oh my gosh, I took a bite of a cookie and I almost threw up. It was too sweet. I mean, so you really do have these changes that happen as a result of changing the way you eat and the way that you perceive the different sweeteners.
Yeah. Well, people are really loving this conversation, Dr. Avena. Susan writes, this subject is near and dear to my heart. I literally cannot stop eating sugar when I start. And that is the case with so many people.
Yes, it's so true. It is so true. And, I started off doing this as a researcher and just doing this in my lab. But then one of the things that got me so excited was to get this information out to people to help them so that people can make decisions about, their health and understand more about what's happening with an addiction. So that's what led me to write my first book called Why Diets Fail Because You're Addicted to Sugar. And it's really just a guide for people who are interested in understanding the science behind sugar addiction. What do we know about this? And more importantly, how can we mitigate it? How can we get sugar out of our diet? And what are some of the psychological steps that we can take to make sure that we stick to that plan?
Well, one of the things I love about what you talk about, and I literally listened to every single YouTube and podcast you had yesterday. That was my getting to know you day, is that like me, you recommend vegetables.
Yes, I do. And I actually recommend vegetables very, very early. I start recommending vegetables when people are pregnant because it is so important that we expose children and babies to the taste of pure vegetables so that they can develop a preference for them later in life. We're having this huge problem right now amongst our youth who've basically never even tasted a vegetable. They're tasting vegetables that are masked with apples or masked with pears. It's always sweetness that's added to the baby food in the form of a fruit. And there's so many babies that are now growing up not liking vegetables because they never actually ate them when they were a baby. And so it's so important that we incorporate vegetables into our diet. And I tell my kids, I have 2 kids of my own, so I can relate to the parental struggles of trying to get kids to eat healthy. I tell them, hey, you know what? Sometimes you have to eat things because they're good for your body and they're going to make you feel good later on. You have to look at, the end game, not necessarily this momentary bliss that you're going to get from eating something sweet.
Yeah. And I find that the longer you wait to give somebody vegetables, the less they're going to like it. And especially if the kid has already been given a lot of sugar. Like I see these things on Instagram with these smash cakes. And I'm thinking, what the hell are you giving a 1-year-old sugar for? They don't care. They don't know. You could give them shaving cream. You could give them mashed cauliflower. They just want to put their hand in it and they're exposing. I mean, how early of the exposure, does that make a difference?
Oh, it absolutely does. I mean, even before birth, we've been learning so much about the foods that women eat during pregnancy and how they can have an impact on the well-being of the baby, not only from a health standpoint, but also from the standpoint of nutrition. And so that's one of the things that I talk a lot in my book about, what to feed your baby and toddler. This is a book that came out a couple of years ago that really outlines the importance of introducing babies to vegetables very early on. I actually advise that people don't even introduce fruits in the first couple of weeks when you start feeding your baby at 6 months. Just start off with all the different vegetables, because they're not getting nutrition that they need from vegetables and from feeding in those first couple of months. They're getting it from breast milk or baby formula. So food before one is for fun and for training your child to develop a healthy palate. And so you don't need to worry about how much they're eating per se. It's more about getting them exposed to all the healthy types of taste that they're going to experience throughout their life.
Right. And, I've looked into some research on vegetables, and there's these compounds in vegetables, especially cruciferous vegetables, the ones that nobody wants to eat, that actually help you be resilient against having cravings for sugar. It's something called thylakoids that I looked into, and they seem to really cut the cravings for sweet.
Yeah, and that's, the thing that's so difficult about cruciferous vegetables is that, they tend to have that little bit of a bitter taste. And as adults, we kind of get over it because, we are able to see the health advantages of them and we can develop a preference for them. But children live in very different sensory worlds than us. And so the bitterness is actually going to be magnified for little kids compared to what we're tasting as adults. So that's what makes it a little bit more challenging. But being persistent is really just the key, and just encouraging children to try and try. And it's really going to pay off in the end, especially if you can get a child that's interested in trying all different vegetables. It's going to help them to be more of an exploratory eater. And it's also going to help them to just have better manners. They'll be able to go to anywhere they want and, find something that they like on the menu or find something they like on the table.
Right. And I remember interviewing, I believe it was Dr. Susan Roberts of Tufts University, and there was research that the more fruits and vegetables, especially vegetables, somebody eats, the lower their body weight and BMI. And when we look to the Asian culture that has only like a 3% obesity rate, they are traditionally a culture that has always eaten vegetables, even for breakfast. And so I think it's really important to eat vegetables.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that, we really need to get that message out there and try to help people to do it a little bit easier. And I love the fact that, we're able to see all these wonderful, delicious dishes that you can create and model for people, so that people can really just understand that it's not that difficult to get the vegetables in your diet. You just have to be creative about it. And it's so important.
I mean, when you roast vegetables like Brussels sprouts, I mean, they taste like candy, especially you put a little balsamic vinegar on them.
Yeah, they do. And I mean, I just think that it's something that can really be a fun way to experiment in the kitchen too. You can come up with different ways to prepare the vegetables to your liking. I mean, you could steam them, you could roast them, you could grill them. I mean, it's really, the sky's the limit. There's so many options.
I don't know if you can see the chat, but so many people watching are saying how they believe that sugar addiction is even harder than, say, an alcohol or drug addiction. For example, Pat says, with 12 steps, you can quit alcohol by locking up the tiger and engaging activities. With food, it's about taking the tiger out 3 times a day, much harder than alcohol.
Absolutely. And I completely agree that, people who are struggling with drug and alcohol addiction, yes, that's extremely difficult, but they're in a different category because they're not constantly being bombarded with advertisements for drugs and alcohol. They're not, seeing billboards with drug paraphernalia as they're driving down the road. They're not having people offer them drugs all day long and have to come up with excuses why they can't use the drugs. Whereas people who are struggling with a food addiction, they really are constantly in the battle, and there's never any let up, because like you said, you have to eat 3 times a day. So you have to figure out, well, what are the foods that I should eat? What are the foods that are going to be my triggers? What do I need to avoid? And it really can be draining. And so I think that we really need to band together and help people so that they can have the tools that they need to overcome this.
Thank you. Mandy, who's watching live, says, for somebody that's really susceptible to a sugar addiction, do you recommend they avoid things like dates?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I tend to err on the side of, if you really are truly having a craving for sugar and you're going to give into it, to then give into something like a fruit or a date, for example, as a good example. Now, dates tend to have a higher sugar content of the fruits out there. So I think that, I don't like to take fruits off the shelf because I think that they have so many health benefits. They have fiber. Also, the amount of sugar that most of them have in them is comparable to what we would expect to see, and it's in balance with all the other nutrients that they contain. So my advice would be to test it on yourself. If you find that you can have one date and that's going to satisfy your craving, then that's great. But if you find that you're wolfing down 8 or 9 dates, then maybe it's time to put the dates on the list of foods to maybe stay away from for a little bit.
Right. When I first discovered food addiction and realized, I always thought I was a sugar addict, but when I finally started getting, food sober, I used dates as methadone to get me off white stuff. Now they are way too sweet for me. I can use them at like a couple in a recipe where it's blended like in a marinara sauce, but they're just like, I just don't like them anymore. They're too sweet. But they did help me get off the hard stuff, which was, I was drinking a Coke Slurpee for breakfast every day with 8 pumps of vanilla syrup till I was 43 years old. That's kind of like not normal human behavior. And then a Dr. Pepper Big Gulp for lunch. And when I think about over 1,000 calories a day were coming from soda from me, basically. And that's why, no wonder I was almost 200 pounds at the time.
Yeah, I think you're right that, using dates as a crutch. Everybody needs a crutch, right? This is not something that you can just cold turkey, wake up one morning and just do it on your own and do it all. So people need support. They need to have, things like figuring out, okay, I'm going to use dates instead of soda, or I'm going to, give myself some artificial sweetener if I have this craving. Those are all okay things to do. And I think that people really need to acknowledge and understand that this is a process, and you're not going to cure yourself overnight. You're not going to fix this all overnight. Your brain is an organ that's been trained from years and years of exposure to excess sugars, and it needs time to heal. And I think that utilizing some of the tools and the tips that are out there can be a great way to let that happen. But you do need to be patient with yourself.
Right. Do you have groups or programs or work with people to help get them off sugar?
I do. I actually do. I see a small number of patients that I counsel about getting off of sugar. I also do group organizations where I'll come and speak to like large groups, and we'll do kind of like more of like a weekend workshop type of arrangement when large groups are put together. And I find that it's really one of the most fulfilling things that I do with my work, to be able to interact with people, to speak with them about their struggles, and then to ultimately see people succeed. It's just so heartwarming when I get calls or emails from people that I've worked with in the past who, I haven't spoken with in months, but they're still trucking along, doing great. And they're just changing their lives. And it's something that is just so rewarding. And I'm so glad that I'm able to be a part of it.
Yeah. So Dale, who's watching, says he was surprised to learn that the processed food industry actually hires scientists to make the already addictive food more addictive.
Yeah, well, it's the ugly truth is the what it is. And, it's part of their marketing, right, is that they want people to buy their products. And so a lot of times, especially with the processed foods, they contain a lot of added sugars, not only to kind of get us hooked because they want us eating them more, but they also have to mask the terrible tastes that are in many of these foods due to the preservatives and the other chemicals that are put in there to make sure that they can stay shelf stable and, sit in the grocery store for 6 months or whatever it might be. And so that's why we see all these different types of sweeteners added. It's about getting us to like it, but it's also about masking the nasty tastes that go along with, all these other ingredients that are required to keep it on the shelf.
Do you think that the advertising and marketing of these highly processed and refined products, especially to children, play a role in the average person's inability to abstain from them?
Oh, absolutely. If you think about it, it's normalized. If you go anywhere, you don't see advertisements for lettuce or for, grapefruits. You never see that. You never see advertisements for anything healthy. Everywhere you go, the internet, when you're driving in your car, when you're, flipping through a magazine, everything is about a highly processed food. And so our brains look at that and say, okay, well, this is normal. This is what we would expect to see. And I think that that's part of the reason why we see so many people struggling with overeating and obesity, because these processed foods have essentially become normalized, not only in terms of the advertising, but just in terms of, how we view them. It's not viewed as necessarily a bad thing if, you grab fast food on the way home from work and school to give the kids for dinner. It's normalized now. And I think that that's the problem. We need to get back to making it so that it's something that maybe people do occasionally, but we're seeing that people are doing this 5 nights a week, 6 nights a week. And that's where we're having the problem.
Well, you're saying it's normalized, but it's really not normal, is it?
No, exactly. And there's a big difference between those two things, right? So normalized means that, it looks like everyone's doing it. So that means it's okay. But it's not normal. We're not supposed to be eating that way. Our bodies were not designed to ingest chemicals like that and to ingest the amounts of sugar that we're ingesting in our society right now. And that's going to catch up with us. And it is catching up with us. That's why we're seeing this crisis of obesity among children and this crisis that we'll be seeing of metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, and all these other health conditions that are largely lifestyle mediated. I mean, it used to be 50 years ago, if you saw a 7-year-old kid and heard he had diabetes, you would assume it was type 1 diabetes and that they were born with it. But now we're seeing so many children struggling with type 2 diabetes. And so this is something that is not going to go away, but we need to make the change. We need to get back to our roots, get back to cooking and make the change so that people can live healthier and longer lives.
Katie, who's watching live, says, is there any correlation between sugar addiction and alcohol addiction?
There actually is. That's a really great question. And so there's been a lot of research that's found there is an overlap between individuals who have a history of alcoholism in their family and then later sugar addiction. And so there's even been studies that have suggested that people who have grandparents who struggled with alcoholism would perhaps develop a sugar addiction. And so they seem to be working on similar neural pathways. And there's a few different neurochemicals that have been identified. One of them is called galanin, and it's basically a neuropeptide in the brain. And it does a lot of things, but one of the things that it does is it's elevated when people consume alcohol. And we also see that it's elevated when people overeat. So there does seem to be this genetic link that we're seeing between alcoholism and sugar addiction that we're still starting to, learn more about as time goes on with the research.
Well, people in the chat are going crazy. They're like, well, what about monk fruit? And what about maple syrup? What about honey? And thanks to the food industry trying to trick us with names. I mean, sugar is sugar. And I always say just because something is less bad doesn't mean it's good. And it's
right,
really
exactly
either abstaining from it completely or finding the one where you'll absolutely eat the less. Because some of the doctors I've interviewed, like Dr. Furman, they'll talk about how just the more you seek that sweet taste, from whether it's stevia or monk fruit, the more you perpetuate to always want a high desire of sweet. So the best thing you can do is, if you want to get over an addiction, is to abstain from it, like you say and I say. Eat your damn vegetables.
Right, exactly. And I think that, the marketing of these alternative sweeteners has gotten out of control. I mean, there's so many products out there now. You go in the grocery store, it'll say, oh, no added sugar. But then you turn over the label and it's got like 5 different types of sweeteners in it. And so it's this little dirty trick that these companies get away with because some of these sweeteners aren't technically considered sugar. So they don't have to say, they can get away with saying, oh, there's no added sugar, but it's still causing you to be addicted to sugar. And so I think that the best thing to really do is just to try to reduce and remove as much of it as you can and not be lured by the siren call of these artificial sweeteners and these alternative sweeteners that promise you the world. They promise your cake and you can eat it too, essentially, right? Because they're saying that, you can have a no sugar added cake, but that's not the case. There's a little bit more to it than just that.
Yeah, the thing is this idea, and you talked at the beginning about how in the DSM, food addiction, sugar addiction looks like an addiction. It's really hard for people that are truly addicted to cut down.
It is. And that's the thing. And I think that's why we're, trying to do studies and trying to better understand what happens in the brain so that we can help people to make these types of changes, because you're right, it's hard. I mean, people who struggle with drug and alcohol addiction, they often need to go away and stay in a hospital for a couple of weeks to detox, to get, their body in a position where they can safely be away from the substance that they're addicted to. And that doesn't happen with food. I mean, we can't, just lock ourselves in the closet for 3 weeks and stay away from food. We have to learn to live with it. And that's what I tell people. It's different than drug and alcohol addiction, because this is an addiction you need to learn to live with and manage. People can walk away from drugs and walk away from alcohol, but you cannot walk away from the food environment, and you need food to survive. So you need to navigate this and figure out, which foods are going to work for you, what's going to cause triggers, what is going to happen in terms of, your environment, like what are the things that might happen in your life that set you off in the path where you're finding that you're compelled to binge or want to eat sugar. One thing that I often see people doing is, once they realize that they're able to stop, is people often use the sugar as a way to self-medicate, as a way to self-soothe. And so they have mild forms of anxiety, mild forms of depression, or sometimes even major forms of anxiety and depression. And they're able to manage it without medication because they're using sugar. They're doing it with the food. And so it's momentarily helping them to feel less anxious and less depressed. But in the long run, it's causing more harm than good. And they're not addressing the root cause of what's making them unhappy.
Yeah, I felt like sugar made my anxiety worse.
Yeah, for some people it does. I think that it depends on the individual. And I think, a lot of times what I find is that in the people who find that the sugar makes their anxiety worse, they get this intense guilt over consuming it almost as they're consuming it. And that feeds into the anxiety and the spiral.
Yeah. So does the degree of processing have anything to do with the addictiveness? Like, for example, Wonder Bread versus Ezekiel bread?
Yeah, absolutely. We published a paper in one of the journals a few years ago where we were asking which foods were most addictive, because this is the question that we're wondering about, right? We have plenty of evidence that suggests sugar can be addictive, but we need to know more about, which actual foods are addictive so people can make better decisions about what they decide to buy and consume. And so the level of processing stood out as the biggest predictor factor. And so the more highly processed the food is, the more likely it's going to lead to addictive like eating. And so that's one of the reasons why, foods with simple ingredients, these, 5 ingredients on the label, the fewer ingredients, the better. Those are the things that are going to be more likely to be healthful and less likely to lead to an addiction. And, it can be tough because, not everybody's a food scientist. And when you're grocery shopping, people don't have time to sit there and read every label. But I think it's important that people come up with their master list of foods and brands of foods that they buy and that they follow, and stick to those, because you might be paying a little bit more money, but in the end, a lot of these foods are just going to be beneficial to your health. And I can think of no other better investment to make than into your own health.
Yeah. Well, I wrote a book over 10 years ago called Unprocessed, and Jack LaLanne seemed to know this like over 80 years ago, that this stuff was not good. He had a whole book about it, and he had sugar addiction. He burned down the family house, I think. It's been a while since I read the book. I actually got to interview his wife, which was amazing. But he said, if God made it, eat it. If man made it, don't eat it. It's this eating of processed food has been so normalized, like you say, but it's really not food.
Right, it isn't. And when I give presentations on this topic, one of the things that I like to do is I'll put up a nutrition facts label for a bag of carrots. And it shows on the bottom of the nutrition facts label the ingredients. And the only ingredients in a bag of carrots is carrots. And then I put up a nutrition facts label for mini crisp Pop-Tarts, which are some desserty breakfast food that's marketed towards kids that you stick in the toaster, and it's supposed to make, the morning easier and everybody's happy. But when you look at the ingredients list, the audience can never figure out what it is, because it contains so many ingredients, so many chemicals, so many dyes, so many things that are basically put in there to make this Pop-Tart look a certain way, feel a certain way in your hands, feel a certain way in your mouth, melt a certain way, and also be able to stay in the package for 5 years or however long it is that they last. And so I think that those are two completely different groups of products. One is a food, carrots are food, but man-made foods that are created in a laboratory are not food, in my opinion. And I think we need to come up with some better terminology to distinguish those two things. And I think that would really help people who are struggling with food addiction, because it would point to which foods they should be avoiding and which foods they should be really trying to focus on.
Yeah, I hope that someday the processed food industry will become accountable, just like the tobacco industry became accountable. I mean,
well,
it's funny how they're so entwined.
They are. And if you look at the history of what happened with the tobacco litigation, and I teach at Princeton University, and I teach a health psychology class. We're actually in the middle of the semester right now. And I give lectures on tobacco history and litigation. And it's very similar to what, we're seeing now. Whereas back before it was out there that smoking can kill you and secondhand smoking was killing other people, there were plenty of executives and plenty of doctors even who were standing up with Philip Morris and saying, hey, we don't think that these are bad for you. We think that cigarettes are not unhealthy. You can have them. And, we're seeing that happening now where, there's this pushback against this idea of food addiction. People will say, oh, well, you just need to exercise more. And, oh, it's, it's not the food. It's that people are being, less active and they're leading more sedentary lifestyles. And I don't think that's the case. I think that, yes, we are a little bit more sedentary than we should be, but it's the food. I really think that the food is the big part of the problem.
I'd love to take a class with you. I bet you're an amazing instructor. You mentioned you put up a slide of showing the nutritional label of a carrot, which really doesn't need a label, and a Pop-Tart. Do you think that having nutritional labels it helps or even deter people? Because not that I would go to McDonald's, but I know that now they actually have their nutritional information posted, and yet people are still eating there.
Yeah, so there's been actually a bunch of studies that have been done on this to see whether or not menu labeling with calories and other information is helpful or not in terms of getting people to make healthier food choices. And what the research has shown is that it doesn't seem to really help when it comes to fast food, because when people make the decision to go to a fast food restaurant, they've already decided that they're not eating healthy. They're not going there for a salad. They're going there because they're having some burger or something that they know is high in calories and high in fat. And so I think that the menu labeling did not help as much as we initially thought it would or hoped it would, because again, that decision had been made before somebody even steps foot into the restaurant. And so I think that, menu labeling in terms of restaurants can be helpful for people who are trying to eat healthier. I don't think it's something that we should have go away, but I think that, for the majority of people that are out there, like when they go out to a restaurant or out to dinner, they look at it as a treat, and that they've already decided that, I'm going to eat whatever I want because this is a treat for myself. And I think that that is where we kind of have the issue that we're up against right now.
Yeah. Do you think that some people can develop a tolerance to sugar and that they can actually experience withdrawal symptoms when they abstain?
Oh, absolutely. We've seen that in our research. We've seen that people can develop a tolerance to it. That's why sometimes maybe people feel satisfied if they have one cookie, but then sometimes people end up having to eat maybe, a whole sleeve of cookies in order to feel like they're satisfied. And that's what tolerance is. Tolerance is when you need to consume more and more and more of the product to feel that euphoric effect or that pleasure that you used to get just from a little bit of it. And the withdrawal piece is real. And I think that people know what this is if they've ever tried to go on a diet. For instance, January is always a big month for this, right? Everybody starts over at the new year, maybe gets on a health kick and starts eating healthy. And then maybe like a week or two into it, usually around like January 10th-ish, people start to say, oh, you know what? I got terrible headaches. Oh, I'm so irritable and cranky. Oh, I just got like this, I don't know, maybe my blood sugar is not high enough or something because I'm not eating enough. And that's when people start to go off of their healthy eating and back onto the processed stuff. And what ends up happening actually around January 10th is that's when the withdrawal symptoms are peaking. People are experiencing the lethargy, the irritability, the sometimes headaches that come along with this low level of withdrawal. That's like what happens with drug withdrawal. And so when people don't know to expect that, they attribute it to other things like blood sugar being low or, some other cause, when it's actually just your body responding to no longer being constantly stimulated with added sugar.
Right. So I heard you say that dopamine has a lot to do with novelty, that when we try a new food. Could you please explain how that works and what role the dopamine in general plays in the brain?
Yeah, so dopamine plays a variety of roles in the brain, depending on, which part of the brain we're talking about. When it comes to the reward system, one of the things that's really unique about dopamine is that every time a drug of abuse is used, it releases dopamine. And so that's the hallmark of drug use, is that every single time someone smokes a cigarette, smokes marijuana, drinks alcohol, you name the drug, it always releases dopamine. Now, food can also release dopamine, but typically food releases dopamine when it's a novel food. And that's because we want to make sure that we're paying attention when we eat something that's new, because it's a survival mechanism. If that food that we're eating that we've never had before makes us sick, we want to make sure that we remember everything about that situation so we avoid it at all costs, because it's life or death. And so typically when we've had a different food that is new to us a couple of times, that dopamine release goes away. It attenuates because the food is safe. And so we're no longer releasing dopamine in response to food. So normally drugs release dopamine and food does not, unless it's a brand new food. But what we see with processed foods, especially those with a lot of added sugar, is that they're releasing dopamine every single time you eat them, just like a drug of abuse would. And so it's more of a drug-like effect on your brain than it is a normal meal type of effect. And that's, I think, where the problem lies, that people are essentially eating foods that are highly addictive, and it's causing this release in dopamine constantly that's creating this cycle of addiction, not only neurochemically, but also behaviorally as well.
That's what I say. I've never known anybody to attend a single Arugula Anonymous meeting.
Exactly. And it's true. I mean, when we look at even the foods that we turn to for comfort foods, if you're having a bad day or, you had an argument with your significant other and you're looking to eat something that's going to make you feel better, nobody ever dives into a big giant bowl of green salad. They dive into ice cream or cookies or pasta or something like that. And so it is really, I think when we take a step back and think about it, we can see how much power these types of foods have over us and have over our emotions.
Yeah, it always seems to be like either the sugar-fat combination or the salt-fat combination, or all three.
Yeah, and that's what's dangerous about our food environment is, you can see these different combinations of those things all over the place in these different food products that are out there. I mean, even in the flavorings of certain foods that you think could be simple and healthy, like popcorn, for instance, no, now we have to make kettle popcorn. It has sugar added all over it. And then you have to add the salt to that too. I mean, so there's just these different permutations that the food companies come up with to really hit all of those points, the sweet, the salty, and the savory too. And that's the trifecta where they can pretty much get everybody hooked.
Yeah, or you can go to there's no fairs right now because of the pandemic, but when I think about county fair, deep fried Snicker bars, they make burgers on Krispy Kreme donuts. It's just crazy.
I know it is. And, I wonder when it's going to stop. Like, at what point are we going to say, okay, this is ridiculous. Like, we do not need a hamburger on a donut. Like, that is just not necessary. And nor is it healthy. And I just hope we get to the point soon where people start to realize the health risks that come with these things and stop viewing it as a novelty or, something that we're just having once in a while, because that's not every once in a while. It's every single day that people are eating like this. And so that's the problem. And that's where we need to make the change.
Well, that's why I love the title of your book, Why Diets Fail, probably because you're addicted to sugar, because I really believe, and that's why I do these summits, that for most people, the excess weight is a result of some degree of a food addiction.
Yeah, and I think so too. I think that, there's different degrees of food addiction. I think that we have people that are addicted to the point where they have a very limited number of foods that they eat. They measure their food and they weigh it. And then we also have people that are maybe a little bit more mildly addictive, where they have a couple of foods that, trigger them, that cause them to binge. But once they can figure out how to manage those foods and replace them with alternatives, then it gets a little bit easier. And I think that, people who are struggling with their body weight, struggling with overeating, hearing about addiction really resonates, and they learn something from it. They feel like they can pull something from the research when I talk about it that really just resonates with them and their story. And so that's why I'm really, always very happy to talk about the research on sugar addiction, because I think it really is helpful to people who are struggling with it.
And I think, like you say, it exists on a continuum, but I think very few people are immune to it. I mean, if you give it to them a long enough and in a high enough dose, I think everybody has the potential to become addicted to this crap.
I do too. And I think we've seen that in our research studies. So we do rat studies and we do human studies in my lab. And when we do the rat studies, I've never met a rat that says no to the sugar and doesn't get addicted, right? So, I mean, it's really one of those things where we're manipulating the variables and, all the rats are getting addicted. So if it was possible to, have this stuff and not get addicted, you would think we would see once in a while a rat that didn't like sugar, didn't get hooked on it, but that's not the case. They all get hooked on it.
Oh boy, Is there any advice for people going through the withdrawal symptoms? I mean, luckily I went to an inpatient food rehab place called the Optimum Health Institute and then to the True North Health Center. So it was a lot easier for me to be in an environment with medical doctors and a complete rest. But a lot of people are trying to do this at home when they've got kids, and that's the other thing. And I wonder how you feel, Dr. Avena, about the importance of the environment, because I find it very challenging for people that continue to feed their family this crap and cook the food and buy it, and while they're trying to abstain from it.
I agree. And the environment is key. And I think that's what often makes or breaks people's success. If you don't have a supportive environment and you're not placing yourself in a healthy environment, then it's going to be extremely difficult to succeed. And I often see this with people who I work with where, let's just say it's the mom. She wants to, lose weight and get off of her addiction to sugar, but then she's got the kids and the husband who are normal weight and have no issues. So she's going to continue to feed them, the unhealthy stuff while she's preparing healthier stuff for her. And I say, well, wait a minute, you're missing the whole point here. The whole point is to get the whole family on board with eating healthy. Like, why would you give something that is poison to you, to your children, knowing that it's poison? It might not be poisoning them right now, but in 5 years, when they have diabetes because of it, then you're going to see, what's happening here. And so I think it's important that the whole family get on board. I think that, like I've been saying, when I talk about this, there's no better investment that you could make in yourself and your children than their health and your health. And even if it means a couple of, arguments at dinner table or coaxing that needs to happen to get kids to try to eat some of these other types of foods, that's what you have to do. And I think that in the end, it's really what's best for everybody. So although it seems like it might be tempting to try to go your own route and then have everybody else just eating the way they want to, it's really not the recipe for success. You're better off if you can get everybody on board with eating healthier. Even if you start off with just one meal a day, what I often recommend people to do is revamp breakfast. Everybody's breakfast is going to be healthy. We got to figure this out. Let's figure out what we're going to eat. I'll do menu creations with people where we can figure out what foods they can eat, what they like, what the kids like. And if you take it meal by meal, it gets easier. So it's not so overwhelming that you have to just wake up one day and completely have a healthy diet.
Absolutely. So you have a new book, What to Eat If You Want to Get Pregnant. You have one, What to Eat If You're Pregnant. And I'm wondering if you could talk about why that's important. And you always mention like the first 1,000 days of life are especially important, which means that most of us are screwed,
Yeah. Yep, you can blame mom for that one. So yeah, my new book that's out now in stores, it's called What to Eat When You Want to Get Pregnant. And this book was, really a labor of love for me because I wrote these other books, What to Eat When You Are Pregnant and What to Feed Your Baby and Toddler, because the research we were doing was starting to focus on the genesis of food addiction. We wanted to figure out, where does this start so we could stop it? And it turns out that it starts in the womb. It starts before you're even born. And so the types of foods that women eat during pregnancy can have a significant impact, not only on the health of their baby, but also their pregnancy. And we're seeing that even outcomes later on, health outcomes in children, are often linked back to what kinds of foods they were exposed to early in life. And that first 1,000 days of life is extremely important. That goes from conception through age 2. And now we're even seeing with the new nutrition guidelines that are being put out for 2021 that there is an emphasis on early life nutrition. And this isn't something we've ever seen before. We've never heard about, focusing on making sure that moms and babies get good nutrition. But now the research is so compelling that it's become a part of the nutrition guidelines. And so, making sure that you're eating well, even leading up to pregnancy, is so important because a lot of the brain development that happens before most women even know they're pregnant. It happens in those first, 6 to 8 weeks. And so being on board with eating healthy is so important for having a good, healthy baby. And it's so important for health outcomes later on. And I really think that if we can get people, and men and women, to eat healthy prior to conception and pregnancy, we have the ability to make some changes and to change some of the damage that we've caused by this food environment that we live in. And we can hopefully have a generation of kids that will be born that'll have a desire to eat vegetables because mom consumed a lot of vegetables during pregnancy. And that's just going to make all the difference in terms of changing this and turning things around.
Well, you said what a person eats when they're pregnant can even affect their unborn grandchildren.
Exactly. Yeah, we have this epigenetic phenomenon. And I mean, it almost sounds like science fiction when you think about it, but it's science truth. It is actually what happens. And it is so important that we pay attention to what we're eating and what we're putting in our bodies, because it's not just about us, but it's about our future babies, grandbabies, down the lineage. And I think that people are hearing that now, and they're starting to think, oh, wow, this isn't just about me. This is about, more than me. Just like when women become pregnant. I mean, I know I have 2 kids of my own. The minute I found out I was pregnant, I ditched drinking wine. I ditched the coffee. I gave up all the things that I knew weren't going to be good for the baby, and it was no problem. And women do this all the time. Women quit smoking who've been smoking cigarettes for 20 years, and they suddenly find they're pregnant and they're able to quit it in a heartbeat because of the baby, because they, are putting the baby before themselves. And so I think if we can put nutrition in that same category and realize that this is a tool to better our children's health and better the way that they're going to live, then I think people will start to get more on board with paying attention to it.
So we live in a population now, at least in the United States, over 70% overweight, more than 40% obese. How does being overweight or obese affect whether a person can get pregnant or their pregnancy? Because I hear from OBGYN doctors, one's going to be on the show now, that it makes delivery more difficult. There's a lot of things that go on when people have excess weight. Maybe they should consider doing something about that before they conceive.
Yeah, so definitely there are health risks that are associated with being overweight or obese when you are pregnant. And, it puts the baby at risk and you at risk for developing gestational diabetes. It also, puts certain risks associated with the labor and delivery, risks for high blood pressure, all of which can be very dangerous situations that you don't want to find yourself in when you're pregnant. And so what we're seeing now is that the average woman of childbearing age is overweight or obese. And so this is happening to a lot of people who are entering a pregnancy where they're already overweight or obese. And so we really have this unique situation where people who are overweight or obese are starting a pregnancy. They're probably not eating a healthy diet to begin with, but doctors don't want to advise a pregnant woman to lose weight. That's the last thing they want to do. And, I've often talked about this at conferences and at different events. And I don't think that we need to focus on weight at all. I think we need to just focus on shifting the food to be healthier and focus on helping people to make some behavioral changes and make healthier decisions about what types of food you put in your body, especially when you're pregnant. And so one of the things that, I always hated when I was pregnant was every time I went to the doctor, I got on the scale and the doctor would weigh me. And that was it. And I felt like I was at the cattle show and I was about to be, auctioned off. But there was never any discussion about, oh, okay, well, you gained 2 pounds since the last visit. Like, what kinds of foods do you like to eat? Or, oh, do you feel like you're eating healthy? Like, that was it. It was just a number on a scale. And that's not really what it should be about. It should be about helping women to better understand what nutrients they need, how they can benefit from eating a healthier diet, and giving them the resources to do so. That's why in my book, I have a lot of recipes and tips to really just incorporate healthier foods into your diet, especially when you're struggling with the throes of pregnancy and cravings and all that.
Right. Thank you. Susan, who's watching live, says, what happens to the brain over time when we continually overuse the pleasure centers of the brain?
Well, a few different things happen. One is that they become desensitized. So the things that used to give you pleasure, the simple things in life, no longer give you pleasure, right? And so we end up wearing our brain down, essentially. And so this is why we see, when people, like you said before, Chef AJ, that when you stopped eating and drinking so much sugar, you were able to find that the date almost tasted aversive because it was so sweet. Well, that's what's happening in our brain. Our brain is the responsible party for that, because what ends up happening is that over time, and I bet if you had a date when you were drinking a lot of soda all the time, you probably would say, oh yeah, these don't taste that sweet. But what ends up happening is that our pleasure systems get rewired over time. And so things that, would normally give us pleasure will not. And that's where the danger, I think, lies, because there's so many things that, could give us pleasure from a nutrition standpoint. Like berries are another example, strawberries. I've had so many people who were addicted to sugar, then stop, then come to me and say, oh my God, I didn't know strawberries actually tasted sweet. I never tasted the sweetness in a strawberry because I was so busy eating, Snickers bars and cookies all the time that my mouth was constantly being stimulated with sugar. I didn't detect the sweetness in these, simple things. And so it is really a fascinating concept, but, when you experience it and see it, it's just amazing.
That's my story as well. I never ate fruit or vegetables till I was 43. And that's how I got the beginning of colon cancer. But I never thought fruit tasted sweet, and I would put sugar on it and still didn't taste sweet enough. And now, the berries right now, the blackberries, if fruit is so sweet, but that's why I don't want to eat desserts, even like what I call compliant ones that I can make out of dates and oats, because then I can't appreciate fruit anymore. And when you stop eating sugar, and especially that fake stevia erythritol crap, vegetables can taste sweet. The romaine lettuce has a hint of like vanilla. Vegetables sweet. There's nothing sweeter than a sweet potato.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think that, people who are struggling with sugar addiction hear this and they're like, what are they talking about? Like that stuff is not sweet, but it really is. You just need to retrain your brain and your tongue and the connections, and you'll be amazed at how different food can taste. It's almost like when people quit smoking. People who've smoked for years, they need to put salt on everything because nothing tastes flavorful to them. But once they quit smoking, things change and they don't need the salt anymore. They can taste the flavors in the food because they're not constantly, wearing down their tongue and their receptors and their brain with, the smoke.
Right. Thank you. Let's see. Susan says, how long does it take for you to be fairly confident that you were over the sugar addiction? My understanding is you never really overcome an addiction. You just learn to manage it day by day the rest of your life. Do things like exercise help people with addictions?
Exercise definitely helps. And I think that one of the things we need to keep in mind is, you might get to the point where you have your addiction under control, but you can't let your guard down ever. I think that this is one of those things that you need to take with you for the rest of your life. And it's going to be something that, many people can get to the point where they're safely managing it. And it's not something that you even have to think about on a day-to-day basis. But I think, you do have to realize that you're at risk because you had this experience and this history of having this happen again. And so I think that you can get to the point where you're safe, but I think you always have to have your guard up and make sure that you're aware of, what's happening in your surroundings.
I just want to thank you again for saying what you said about, if you know it's poison and you're not eating it, why would you keep giving it to your kids? And this is, I have these programs, and I just started a new one on Tuesday, and I have someone in the program with 5 kids and someone that has 8 kids. And it's really hard for them because the stuff is in the house. But again, it's like, I can't tell people how to raise their kids, but it's like, this is bad. So why do they get it?
Right. If it's bad for you, it's bad for them, right? That's my philosophy on it. So I think that it's a whole family situation. And that's why I often work with, the kids too, because it's something that, the family dynamic is going to change. And if everybody's on board with getting healthy, then that's just going to make things all the more easier, especially for the person who's struggling with the sugar addiction.
Great. You have so many wonderful books. My audience, I'm guessing, because I'm in my 60s, it might be a little bit older, so they might not be trying to get pregnant. They might have daughters or granddaughters that are. But would you like to talk about some of your other books? Because I didn't even realize Hedonic Eating. That sounds like a fantastic title for a book.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, Hedonic Eating is actually it's an academic book. It's a book that I edited, and it really covers all these different aspects of the hedonic aspects of food addiction and of eating and the pleasure associated with eating. And so it's a great book that was, we have, I guess, probably 20 different chapters on different topics that are authored by the leaders in the field. And it's really just a wonderful, wonderful book. And it really delves into the research behind what makes food so pleasurable.
I love that. And I love why diets fail. We definitely have to have you on the summit to talk about that, because they do. It's something like 98% of people that lose weight through a great deal of suffering and deprivation gain it all back. One of the things you say, and again, that's why I love you and have you on the show, because I love all the things you say, but one of the things in particular with weight loss, you say that often losing weight slowly is better. And I have found that it took me 27 months to lose my weight. People want to lose weight like that, so they'll do keto or weight, something that's very restrictive, but that they can't continue doing it. So why did you say that it's that the people that tend to lose weight more slowly tend to keep it off?
Well, it has to do not only just with our body being able to change in a way that can keep up with slow and steady weight loss. But also we have to give ourselves time for our behaviors to stick and our psychology to change around food. And I think that happens when people are more steadily and slow with their weight loss. And I think everybody wants that magic bullet. We all want to lose that 5 pounds, 10 pounds, or whatever it is right away. But what I tell people is anybody could do that. If I ordered you to only eat X, Y, and Z, I could design a diet where you're going to lose all that weight instantly, but that's not going to last. It's not sustainable. You need to learn the behaviors associated with maintaining a lower body weight, not just some crash diet that's going to allow you to lose that weight that you're going to regain and then often regain more than you had initially lost. And so I think that the tools and the psychology behind it is almost more important than the number on the scale. Because once you learn those tools, and you're a perfect example of this, Chef AJ, where once you learn the tools and what you have to do, then it can become a sustainable lifestyle. You don't have to be on this yo-yo of losing weight, gaining weight, losing weight, gaining weight.
Right. Just have to take a moment to ask Alina for her super chat donation. She says, thank you, Chef AJ, for this info. Why did I feel anxiety when I used to eat sugar? Because Dr. Avena said some people, it helps their anxiety, but it's really a transitory help. It's not really helping.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's really a Band-Aid for the anxiety.
Yeah, I just love the work you do. Thank you. It's such an honor and a pleasure to finally meet you, because we've been kind of in concentric circles, but never quite meeting. So this is fan. How can we support your work? Find out more about you. I mean, there is show notes where we put your books and your Instagram link and your website. But what do you prefer? Do you like us to follow you on Instagram, or can we support you?
Yeah, I'm out there. So however people want to follow me, that's great. Like, I have a website, drnicoleavena.com, where there's links to all of our research articles and different news stories about healthy eating, sugar addiction, food addiction. Also, I'm on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and the handle is Dr. Nicole Avena. And so definitely check those out if you're interested in learning just more about the research and more about what's happening and different ways in which you can improve your health and, hopefully beat that sugar addiction.
Do you ever take people like me in your lab and study us? I would love to see if my brain has normalized now that it's been, I give it July 6, 2003 was my quit date.
Yeah. And I bet, you know what, in hindsight, I wish we had scanned your brain before that, and then we could scan it now and keep scanning it to see. I bet we would see so many changes for the better. And that's just, so amazing, so wonderful.
My heart goes out to anyone that's suffering, because for years thinking something was wrong with me when it wasn't me, it was the food. And once I stopped and drinking that food, I recovered.
Yes, exactly. It's not you, it's the food. I feel like that's the slogan that we need to be telling people.
Yeah, well, let's make some t-shirts. I'll ask one more question that just came in. Anna says, can you please ask Dr. Nicole the best way to give up sugar, steps, and if so, what are they, or cold turkey? I say go to True North, because that's worked for me.
Well, I think fortunately, there's lots of options out there now. And I talk about this in Why Diets Fail. I have a plan that I outline for people to basically wean themselves off of sugar. I don't advocate cold turkey because I think it's too overwhelming for most people. A lot of people just don't have the knowledge and the time to figure out where sugar is in all the different places in our diet. And so if you check out my book, I kind of walk through the different steps of, how you can wean yourself off of sugar. What are the foods to avoid? What are the foods you want to replace with instead? And really just better understand the psychology of habit change and how you can change those bad habits so that you can make healthful ones in their place.
That is so great. Well, thank you so much. I so enjoyed talking to you.
Oh, thank you so much.
It's wonderful meeting you. And thanks all of you for watching another episode of Chef AJ Live. Please come back in 2 hours at 2 p.m. Pacific time, when my guest is Dr. Sadiq Shiraz from the True North Health Center, and he'll be talking about how to transform unconscious dysfunction into unconscious function. That's a mouthful. Take care, Dr. Nicole, and best of luck with your new book.
Thank you so much.